Just before sunrise, in a field near Fairfield, Connecticut, three men were holding ropes attached to a homemade flying machine that looked less like an airplane and more like something a very confident goose might sue for impersonation. The machine had two wings, a boat-like body, bicycle-style wheels, and a motor built by a German immigrant mechanic named Gustave Whitehead. It had already rolled down the road under its own power, because apparently it also had to be a car. Then the men could not hold it anymore. Whitehead shouted for them to let go. The propellers bit into the morning air, and according to a newspaper reporter watching nearby, the machine rose above the field, climbed to roughly 50 feet, crossed about half a mile, and came down gently on its wheels. This was August 14, 1901, 2 years and 4 months before Kitty Hawk. And yet, if you ask almost anyone who flew first, they will not say Gustave Whitehead. They will say Wilbur and Orville Wright. Not maybe, not probably, just the Wright brothers, full stop. So the question is not really, did Whitehead fly first? That question has been argued for more than a century, usually by people with strong opinions and very little patience. The stranger question is this: how does a man get written out so completely that even a state law, a recovered photo claim, and a major aviation reference book can barely put his name back in the room? To understand that, we have to start with the only thing more fragile than a flying machine made of bamboo, silk, and optimism: evidence. Whitehead was not a polished inventor with a lab, a legal team, and a neat paper trail. He was a working mechanic. He built engines, gliders, and odd aircraft that might inch him closer to the sky. His aircraft number 21, nicknamed the Condor, was described as having folded wings, road wheels, and two engines, one to move it on the ground, and another to turn the propellers in the air. If the report is accurate, Whitehead did not just make an early airplane. He made one of history's first deeply inconvenient flying cars. The Bridgeport Sunday Herald published the story on August 18, 1901. The writer, usually identified as Richard Howell, claimed to have seen the machine fly. The article was vivid, almost too vivid. It described the men letting go, the aircraft rising like a bird, Whitehead waving back from the controls, and the machine settling down after its little trip over the Connecticut grass. It is exactly the kind of source historians both love and hate. Love, because it was contemporary. Hate, because it was a flowery newspaper feature with no surviving flight photo, no formal log, and no clean chain of documentation that makes everyone shut up and go home. And that missing photo would become the first trapdoor in Whitehead's story. The article reportedly had an image, but what survived publicly was an illustration, not a clear photograph of the machine in the air. Later reports referred to a photo of a Whitehead machine in flight at a 1906 aviation exhibition. But then the photo vanished, because history has a wonderful habit of misplacing the exact object everyone would like to see. Decades later, supporters went looking for it. They found witnesses. They found old clippings. They found people who said they remembered Whitehead flying, long after the fact. But memory after 30 years is not a camera. It is more like a witness sketch drawn by a sleepy raccoon. Whitehead did build aircraft. Whitehead did build engines. Whitehead was known in early aviation circles. He had later designs. He had enough technical ability that even skeptics did not usually dismiss him as some random man with curtains and a dream. But the strongest version of history does not reward probably. It rewards repeatable proof. And the Wright brothers understood that better than almost anyone. By December 1903, the Wright brothers had something Whitehead never really managed to keep: a controlled documentation machine. They had notebooks. They had careful experiments. They had photographs. They had witnesses. They had a story that could be packaged, defended, patented, and repeated. They were not instantly believed. For years, many people doubted them too. In the early 1900s, claiming you had flown was a bit like claiming your toaster had learned French. Interesting, but please show us the toaster. The Wrights eventually did. Their 1903 flyer became not just a machine, but a legal and historical object. A thing that could be pointed to. A thing that could hang in a museum. A thing that could say, without speaking, this happened. Whitehead had a newspaper story. The Wrights had an archive. And once history has to choose between a messy local legend and a museum-ready artifact, the local legend is usually the one asked to wait outside. But their path into the museum was not simple either. In fact, the institution that would later guard their legacy once became one of their biggest enemies. The Smithsonian had its own aviation hero, former Secretary Samuel Langley. Langley had built a large flying machine called the aerodrome. It was launched in 1903, twice. It went into the water, twice, which is not ideal behavior for an airplane, unless the airplane is secretly a canoe. Years later, the Smithsonian allowed Glenn Curtiss to modify and test Langley's machine. After those altered tests, the institution displayed the aerodrome in a way that suggested it had been capable of flight before the Wrights. Orville Wright was not amused. Actually, not amused is too small. Orville was so furious that he sent the original Wright flyer to London. Imagine creating the symbol of American aviation and then shipping it overseas because the American Museum kept complimenting a different man's bathtub accident. This feud lasted for years. The Smithsonian eventually backed down. Orville agreed the flyer could return. But by the time it came home in 1948, Orville had passed, and his estate wanted guarantees. So they made a contract. And this is the sliding door. For $1, the Smithsonian acquired the Wright flyer. But the agreement included a clause saying the Smithsonian could not publish or display a statement claiming that any aircraft before the 1903 Wright flyer was capable of carrying a man under its own power in controlled flight. Read that again, because this sentence is doing more work than it seems. It did not simply praise the Wrights. It created a penalty for contradicting them. If the Smithsonian ever officially recognized an earlier powered, controlled flight, it could risk the artifact that had become the crown jewel of American aviation. Now, to be fair, the clause was born from the Langley feud, not from a cartoon meeting about erasing Gustave Whitehead. The Wright estate wanted to prevent the Smithsonian from reviving the old Langley claim. But history does not care only about intentions. It cares about incentives. And the incentive was very clear: do not recognize anyone before the Wrights. This is where Whitehead's ghost starts knocking on the wall. Because from this point forward, the Smithsonian was not just another museum evaluating evidence. It was the museum holding the Wright flyer under an agreement that made certain conclusions very inconvenient. If Whitehead's case was weak, the clause did not matter. But if Whitehead's case was even plausible, then the clause mattered a lot. For decades, the official answer stayed basically the same. Whitehead was interesting, but not proven. The Herald's story was suspicious. The witnesses were late. The photo was missing. His later machines did not clearly repeat the feat. And compared with the Wrights' documentation, the case remained a foggy field at dawn. Then, in 1937, Stella Randolph published The Lost Flights of Gustave Whitehead, pulling him back into public view. She treated the old accounts not as folklore, but as clues. Her work did not settle the case, but it made one thing harder: pretending there was no case at all. Still, the Wright story had momentum. Schools taught it. Museums displayed it. North Carolina and Ohio fought over it. The words "first in flight" became less a conclusion than a brand. And brands do not like footnotes. Then came 2013. Australian researcher John Brown claimed he had recovered the long-lost 1901 flight photo, or at least found it hidden inside a photograph of a 1906 aviation exhibition. It was blurry, distant, and immediately controversial, which is another way of saying it was a perfect aviation history grenade. That same year, Paul Jackson, editor of Jane's All the World's Aircraft, credited Whitehead ahead of the Wrights. Connecticut followed with a public act recognizing Gustave Whitehead's powered flight and creating Powered Flight Day in his honor. For a brief moment, it looked like the old story might crack. Then the counterattack came. Smithsonian historians and right defenders argued the evidence still did not meet the standard. The photo was too blurry. The witness trail was too messy. Some supposed witnesses denied seeing it. Whitehead's later work did not produce the kind of clear, repeated success one would expect from someone who had solved powered flight in 1901. And honestly, that last point is not nothing. If Whitehead had truly flown half a mile in 1901, why did he not dominate aviation? Why did the Wrights become the ones who refined control, repeated flights, built a system, and changed the world? There are possible answers. Whitehead was poor. He was disorganized. He lacked business sense. He may have been a better mechanic than self-promoter. He may have made a short, unstable powered hop that was real but never became a practical airplane. Or maybe the skeptics are right, and the Herald inflated a failed experiment into a miracle. The frustrating part is that both versions explain some of the evidence. Which brings us back to the contract. The Smithsonian-Wright Agreement does not prove Whitehead flew. It does not. A legal clause cannot turn bamboo and silk into altitude. The problem is that it makes official history look less like a clean judgment and more like a locked cabinet. Maybe the Wrights were first in the way that matters most: controlled, sustained, repeatable powered flight with proof strong enough to survive the century. That is still the mainstream view, and there are serious reasons for it. But maybe Whitehead represents something history is terrible at handling, a messy first step that happened before the clean one. The first person to cross a threshold is not always the person who builds the doorframe, writes the manual, and gets the museum plaque. Sometimes the first spark burns out in a field before sunrise, seen by a few people, recorded in one strange article, then buried under better paperwork. And maybe that is the real reason the Whitehead story refuses to stay buried. It is not only a fight over who flew first. It is a fight over how history decides what counts as real. A clear photograph counts. A patent counts. A museum label counts. A contract, somehow, also counts. A poor mechanic in Connecticut may have lifted into the air before the Wright brothers, or he may have only lifted himself into one of aviation's most stubborn legends. But the most revealing part is not the half-mile flight. It is the $1 agreement that followed 47 years later. Because whether Gustave Whitehead was first or not, the contract shows something uncomfortable about history. It is not always written by the first person to do something. Sometimes it is written by the person who keeps the artifact, controls the label, and makes sure the door only opens one way.